Good morning, friends. There are a couple of different ways to read the Bible. And when I say that, I mean there are a couple of different kinds of assumptions you can make when you read the Bible that affect how you read the Bible. You may actually remember that we talked about something like this when we talked about certain assumptions that affect the way we understand our Lord's teachings in the Olivet Discourse. Do we assume he's talking about things that haven't happened yet? Do we assume he's talking about things that merely happened in the first century? Or from the perspective I've been trying to teach from on Sunday mornings, do we assume that he's talking about things that did happen, at least in an initial sense, in the first century, but that will also have a greater or more complete fulfillment in the future? And of course, there are reasons why people would adopt any one of those assumptions. And when it comes right down to it, this happens as we read the entire Bible. We come to it, the whole Bible, as we read it with certain assumptions. Not so much about when things happen, although that can be in the mix, but for our purposes today, we have the idea of how literally we should take the Bible. What I mean by that is, what do we do with figurative language in the Bible? Do we recognize figurative language as such in the Bible? How do we know if something is figurative, if it's symbolic, or if it's to be taken, as we usually call, literally or not? For example, in John 10, verse 9, Jesus says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." Well, is Jesus really a door? Well, yes, he is. But he's clearly a metaphorical door. He is the portal through which we enter salvation. But he's not a quote unquote literal physical door that we have to bodily pass through. So that one is pretty easy. Jesus is using a metaphorical expression. He's using a symbol, figurative language to help explain who he is and what he does and how it is that people enter salvation, aka only through faith in him. But for another example that's probably familiar to you, what about the number 1,000 in Revelation chapter 20? This is a big one. We read, "And the angel seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended." Well, this 1,000 years coincides with a 1,000-year reign of Christ, along with the saints from a little bit later on in the text, at the conclusion of which Satan will be loosed for a little while before his ultimate defeat. So, should we consider the number 1,000 here to be literal or figurative? Are we talking about a literal mark it on your calendar from beginning to end 1,000 years? Or, as I mentioned Sunday, might this number be taken figuratively, symbolically, as a number intended to represent a large quantity, or in this specific context, the fullness of time which God intends from beginning to end, regardless of how long that time will actually be, whether it's 1,000 years or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10,000 years. Because numbers can be and often are used in a symbolic manner in Hebrew literature, especially in apocalyptic literature. And how we understand the way this number is being used here, either literal or symbolic, is going to drastically change what we conclude about the Bible's teachings concerning the end times. And obviously, I've already hinted at why I think the number 1,000 should be understood figuratively. I've already kind of given that those reasons. But there are other biblical and historical reasons to consider it as well. And of course, people who take the opposite side, who think it should be a literal 1,000 years, they have their own reasons for that as well. So I don't want to act like I'm the only one that has reasons. That my reasons are logical and theirs aren't. No, we have these assumptions on both sides, and there's reasons for them. And so often we have to not even look at the assumption itself so much as the reasons for that assumption to see if the assumption is valid. In any case, this gives us a bit of an introduction to figurative language in the Bible and some of the difficulties we have in knowing when it's being used and when it's not. Because again, if you take something that's figurative that's intended to be literal, you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. And obviously, if you take something that's literal that's intended to be figurative, you will likewise find yourself going down the wrong path. So that introduces a bit of the interpretive matter that we must deal with any time we read the scriptures. In what way should I be reading this? How literally should I take it? How figuratively should I take it? Because it makes a huge difference. And we can talk about the different answers to those questions that lead us to know how literally or how figurative we should take it, but that will be for another time. Because right now I want to drive a different point home today, which is this. We obviously want to be careful not to take things in a figurative sense when they weren't intended to be taken figuratively. We shouldn't see symbols everywhere just because we like symbols, okay? Because truly we can get ourselves into a big hairy mess if we start assuming that every last thing we read is actually symbolic rather than something else. Because at that point, you're allegorizing everything and any sense of objective meaning gets lost completely. But at the same time, even as we watch out to avoid that abuse on that far end of the spectrum, we don't want to react by taking things too far the other side either, by taking things that are metaphorical, and then saying, well, we shouldn't see them as being metaphorical because we want to avoid all those symbolisms as if the symbols are inherently bad. Okay, because they're not. The Bible does use metaphor. The Bible does use symbol and figurative language, and it's not bad for us to understand and accept those things as being figurative. For instance, in this debate between the person who wants to take the Bible literally versus the one who sees figurative language, I've heard many times before where the literalist will complain at the person who sees the symbols is simply not taking the Bible seriously. Okay, that's why they want to avoid that. We're going to take it literally because that's the way to take the Bible seriously. To just believe what it says, that's taking the Bible seriously. And I can appreciate that desire and that motivation. I really, really can. But the result ends up being that if the person who looks at the number 1,000 in Revelation 20 and takes it as being symbolic rather than a literal 1,000-year span of time, well, the conclusion is that person is playing fast and loose with the scripture. That they're being disrespectful to the scriptures because they're ignoring the plain meaning, so to speak. You know, we see the number 1,000, it must mean 1,000. And to come to any other conclusion is just irresponsible. Or to bring it to the text we covered on Sunday, when Jesus talks about the sun and the moon going dark and the stars falling out of the sky in Matthew 24, then we should take that at face value, that these are physical things that Jesus is describing. He says they're going to happen, and clearly those things did not happen in the first century. Therefore, Jesus isn't talking about first century events at all, and so we must apply the teachings of the Olivet Discourse only to events that haven't happened yet, because clearly the sun and the moon have not gone dark yet. The stars have not fallen yet, so it must still be future to us. And often the idea is then that people like myself who would read Jesus' words and understand them as being figurative rather than literal, the idea that comes back at us is that we're actually reducing the power or reducing the significance of what Jesus is saying by assuming that it's figurative, as if something being symbolic automatically makes what's being said less serious, which is why people like myself undercome attack for not taking the Bible seriously. Because clearly, or again, as the thought goes, the sun and moon going dark, the stars falling from the sky is a far more dire situation, a far more serious situation than if Jesus just uses that language, but it doesn't actually happen. The thought, therefore, is that the figurative approach lessens the impact or the importance or the significance of what's actually being said, and that is to be avoided. But brothers and sisters, I don't see that as being the case at all, because symbols by their nature don't reduce the reality that they point to. They actually intensify the reality they point to. Because the whole point of a symbol is that it points past itself to something greater. For instance, let's take a common symbol, an actual sign, okay, that you would see at the intersection of two roads, a stop sign. Now, that stop sign's only purpose is to act as a symbol. It is itself a metaphor, okay? A metaphor of what? A symbol of authority. A symbol of the authority that says you need to stop at this intersection and obey all traffic laws regarding passing through an intersection. Otherwise, consequences, right? That is the point of the stop sign itself. That's what it does. It acts as a symbol of an authority far greater than itself. Because clearly the stop sign itself can't do anything to the person who blows past it. It's just a symbol. It can't do anything itself. But what it symbolizes, the authority it actually points to, in this case, the police, they are far greater than the stop sign and they can do something about it. And so the stop sign points to the thing that is far greater than itself. In the same way, when the Bible uses metaphors and other figurative language, it's not for the purpose of lessening things or of making things less serious or less intense. Rather, you take whatever seriousness level the symbol itself might indicate, and then you realize that the reality that the symbol is pointing to is far greater yet. Again, going back to the idea of the sun and moon darkening and the stars falling from the skies, the heavens being shaken, the sky rolling up like a scroll, etc. All those descriptions coming from Matthew 24, as well as the other passages that we can find throughout the Old Testament. And those passages applied clearly, especially the Old Testament passages, clearly applied to events that already happened at particular points in times, and we can verify that. But on none of those occasions did the sun or moon actually go dark, the stars fall from the sky, and so on. So since those things didn't have happened, how can I say that taking things metaphorically does not reduce the intensity or seriousness of the situation? Because of what the figurative language does point to. It points to the fact that all these judgments, all of these things that came upon the various nations that are spoken of in those passages, including Israel itself, all these judgments were from God himself. The language of the heavens being shaken in relationship to Israel being overwhelmed by the forces of Babylon is to make it very clear that the problem wasn't just that Babylon was stronger than Israel. It wasn't just that, Israel was this teeny tiny little country and Babylon was this mighty vast empire and that, Israel, they finally got gobbled up by the big empire. No, the language that's used here is to indicate that God himself was against Israel. That this was not just the ebb and flow of world politics and national powers. Okay, it wasn't just that Israel's military failed them or their tactics failed them. No, it's to indicate that this is a situation where God himself was fighting against Israel because he was judging them for their wickedness and rebelliousness against him. And with that in mind, is that not more serious, more intense than even the physical heavens being shaken? I mean, we just saw an eclipse where the sun went dark not too many weeks ago, and it was impressive. It was a significant experience that I'd never experienced before. But did that experience hold a candle to the idea that God himself was judging a nation and a people? The answer to that question, of course, each one of us needs to answer for ourselves. But on my mind, there's no comparison. Let me apply the idea of this judgment coming upon me. That when Jesus says the sun will darken, the moon will darken, the stars will fall, that he's talking about a judgment that's coming upon me, okay? Let the stars fall. But if God is with me, or if I'm with God, however you wish to think of it, if we're together, the sky itself can fall, and it doesn't matter. But if the description of those heavenly shakings doesn't point to the reality of the sun and the moon actually going dark, but it does point to the reality that God is judging me and therefore he's not on my side, that God is actively against me, how much worse is that? Infinitely worse. In the first situation, the sun and moon could quite literally go dark. The stars could fall from the skies. But if the Lord is on my side still, I'm fine. But in a second situation, the sun and the moon only figuratively are spoken of as going dark. But the whole point of that description of that figurative language is to communicate to me that God is against me. And in that case, I am doomed. How much worse for the language to be figurative, pointing past itself to the reality that God is judging me. How much more serious and far worse that situation is than if the sun and moon were just literally going dark and that's all it was. Friends, in this way, I hope for us all to understand that we need to take the Bible as it's intended to be taken. That yes, we need to be as careful as possible not to take figurative language literally in order to turn a literal language into figurative language when it shouldn't be. But where it is appropriate to take figurative language as figurative language, to see symbols where there actually are symbols. And that's based on a whole lot of things that we don't have time to get into right now. But when that happens, let's not conclude that taking it as figurative reduces anything. It does not make us take the scriptures less seriously, not at all. Rather, it points us to an even greater reality beyond the symbol itself, which generally means that the reality is even more intense and more serious than the symbol or the figurative language is actually being used. So, figurative language and symbolism is very important in the scriptures, and it's very prevalent in the scriptures as well. And so it's my hope that we understand it as best as possible to come to the best possible conclusion that is as accurate as possible to what God intends for us to understand. With that, let me tell you that I love you. I pray you have a good and godly day. And if the Lord wills, I'll see you soon.